Today in this episode of Thrive with R3, we're going to be talking about key market trends, workplace readiness, and leadership challenges in a rapidly evolving business environment. We'll discuss how companies and leaders can build resilience and support multi-generational workforces. Stay tuned for insights related to all of this and more. You're not going to want to miss this episode.
Welcome everyone to this episode of Thrive with R3. I'm your co-host, Jamie Gassmann, here with my other co-host, Dr. Vergolias, and we're coming to you live from the studio today, which is very exciting. And we're going to be talking to you about well-being strategies for the evolving workplace. Let's start, George.
Yes.
Talk to me about kind of this evolution of well-being in the workplace. It's not a new term, and we've been navigating these waters for a while. But when you think about the last decade, and we think about, all the different kind of eras of well-being. And I'm gonna dive into that. I think we've narrowed it down to like 4 key kind of areas and like where we're at right now from your behavioral health perspective.
Yeah, thank you. That's a great question. And what we see a lot in the consulting that we do out in the real corporate and business world is a varied understanding of what that evolution has been. Mm-hmm. I mean, the reality is corporate culture, while it has evolved and it's always evolving, from a perspective of well-being, it has not grown much in the last 20 or 30 years. There's been a little bit of an uptick, and I would say the 2010s, and then there's been a massive acceleration since the pandemic. And so you had kind of a pre-pandemic world where I think well-being was kind of given lip service. Mm-hmm. If you worked for that small 5 or less percentage of companies that really dedicated themselves to it, maybe you got a really robust well-being offering, but it was generally lip service or a nice to have as an add-on. Mm-hmm. Then the pandemic hit. We all know what that was like. Homeschooling our kids, right? Inability to connect with real people in real life. Sports shut down. Masks, we all been through that. I don't want to re-traumatize anyone by going into that again. Yeah. And then there was the post-pandemic adjustment period. And I think of that as about a year to 18 months when we started coming out of the pandemic. Still, people were working remotely from home. There was still a lot of adjustments that businesses and corporations needed and organizations needed to make around how do we function as a business in this new world. But now we are in what we could call the next normal. There's a lot of different titles we can give. And for me, the biggest takeaway is when the pandemic hit, it forced everybody to take a collective pause emotionally. I mean, business still moved on, right?
Yeah.
And physically, that's right.
Yeah.
That's a great point. And so we had to just slow down. Meetings slowed down. At one point, they started accelerating again, right? With all kinds of crazy amounts of MS Teams and Zoom meetings. But things had to slow down, and people began to take an inventory of what have I been missing from a well-being angle? Another question is, what is work-life integration or work-life balance? And what does that really mean for me?
Yeah.
So it kind of stopped the treadmill that we were all on, right? Mm-hmm. And what happened to, I think, us from an emotional, psychological well-being space is once we came out of the pandemic, got through the adjustment phase, and now we're many years past, most people are not going back.
Yeah.
It doesn't mean we won't go back into working at work or having a hybrid schedule, but we're not going back to that rat race mentality that many people just took as this is part of the game in 2016, 17, 18.
Yeah.
And so that, I think, is the challenge that leaders need to figure out in this new world where well-being is a priority. And at the same time, it's tough to run a business. Mm-hmm. And Lord knows, and I'm not making any commentary politically, but it's been tough, globally recently with all kinds of economic changes. It is tough to run a business, and we really need our workers to be engaged and dedicated. Mm-hmm. We all have to redefine what does that look like.
Yeah. Well, and I think if you look at too the generational changes, and I know it's said many times, so we're not the first, piece of, video content or podcast or even, any place that's shared this where it talks about there's 5 different generations in the workforce right now. And the interesting thing with those generations is they've all lived through different things. When you like have your boomers and you have your Xers, where it's like it's the grind. That's what we grew up in our careers with. That's what we were exposed to as we were growing up. Our parents working that way. And then you've got kind of your millennials who are kind of like in between on that. And then you've got some of these newer generations coming in where it's like there's an expectation of what they're going to tolerate or not tolerate. They might give you that few extra hours overtime occasionally, but they're not going to work the 70, 80-hour weeks like what we've seen from previous generations. So that creates kind of some different barriers and elements to workplaces navigating this new kind of well-being normal. And their expectations of support is different.
Yeah. And what's interesting is if you look at recent Gallup, fairly recent, a couple of years ago, Gallup polls, and just look at the workplace trends, I think by 2027, maybe 28, something like 70% of the workforce globally will be millennials and Gen Z. I mean, that's a huge shift as the boomers fully retire and then Gen X starts moving into retirement. So it's an interesting shift. And younger cohorts, they want a lot of the things that us older folks, I'm an older Gen X, born in 1969. So, I want good pay. I want to feel valid at work. I want to feel that I have some agency and the ability to make a difference. But things like meaning and purpose and the ability to bring my true self to the workplace, I never thought of that when I was younger. It just wasn't an issue.
No.
You don't bring your true self.
You were constantly proving yourself.
You've got your work identity, you've got your home identity.
Yes.
And
you
hopefully
don't blend them.
never the two shall meet,
No.
right? That's how we came up.
Totally.
But younger folks, they want that sense of meaning and purpose. They want to feel that their supervisor supports them and is helping them to drive forward. They want to feel that the company is doing something purposeful and meaningful. And so older leaders that didn't come up that way, they have to completely reorient their approach.
Workplaces are human places. And so when you look at the variety of humans that you have in any given workplace, you look at the variety of different generations, you look at all the different challenges that they might be navigating at home, could be health challenges, could be spousal challenges, could be kid challenges, or just life in general.
Aging
parents, the sandwich generation.
Yes.
Maybe they're new home buyers that are trying to navigate this new shift in their financial, stability. So that your employees and your leaders are coming to work with all of these different things. How do you make sure that workplace, that's a human place, has those well-being offerings that are tailored to fit their specific needs?
Yeah.
So for so long, I think it was, status quo of, well, we have an EAP, which EAPs are great and they offer great benefits, but a lot of times people maybe don't see that. So how do you make sure that you're tailoring your program where it's addressing the different kind of nuances of what people want and what they need?
Yeah, it's so important in this day and age and it's assumed in the question, but it's so important to tailor those programs.
Yeah.
And I think a few things that we have found over time, and I think the research bears this out, is one, you have to understand before you move to judgment. And that's at an individual level, but at a programmatic level, understand before you move to strategy. Understand your culture, understand your people. And one thing that I'm going to say that for some may be a little bit, I don't think it's controversial, but some may think it is. If you're the leader of an organization or a company, be unapologetic about the nature of what that culture is and who is a good fit and who isn't. Now, if you're too rigid with that, you're going to lose talent.
Right.
Talent's going to leave or they're not going to want to join you. You also, though, can't have a cultural identity that adopts everything. Any given company or culture can't be everything to everyone.
Right.
So they have to be clear on this is the realm or the range of what our culture is. This is how well we can help assimilate and accommodate to differences, which is wonderful. Be flexible, but at the same time, we can't break. And so somebody that will thrive at a super type A law firm that just demands long billable hours may not be the same person that works for a nonprofit charity. And that they might,
Right.
and that's fine.
Right.
But so first it's understanding your culture. From there, having clear communication about that and what you value as a culture. We at R3, I think we do a really good job of that, right?
Yes.
We're clear about what
Absolutely.
our values
Yeah.
are. We talk all the time about those. And then from there, continue to seek input about what's working and what isn't. Clarify the direction, clarify the mission and the purpose so people have an idea and they can get behind it. And then from there, execute on that strategy in a way where all of those values and that purpose and that mission is all consistent.
Yeah, it definitely starts with that culture, but then asking your people too.
Yes.
I think
Absolutely.
when you're thinking about well-being, particularly being we've got different generations, we shouldn't assume that somebody who is young in their career isn't thinking about retirement. We shouldn't assume that somebody who's older in their career isn't thinking about career growth. And so how do we survey and really understand what are the key benefits that these individuals, it's important to them that they want to get behind. And I think having those continued dialogues is super important, especially now. I know what we find at R3 is our staff wants to be heard and they want to know that you heard us. And how are you acting on those things? And how are you staying true to that culture and that brand identity or that employer identity that you've created for yourself? And how are you staying true to that? And
And those assumptions, I think, to not assume is such a great point. Because you go back 20, 30 years ago, the idea, for example, of a stay-at-home dad,
yeah,
or even a dad that's working, but who is still the primary caretaker of the kids, because mom is a 100% baller. She makes a lot more money, and she has to do a lot of traveling. You see this now.
yeah,
But you didn't see that 20 years ago, 30 years ago. Heck no. My situation, full disclosure, I'm very open about this. I got divorced about a year ago, and my travel schedule isn't as flexible as it once was. Because my ex was, for a good while throughout my career, was a stay-at-home mom. And then when she went back to the workforce, she was working locally. Well, now I've got the kids every other week, and we have a wonderful amicable relationship. But the reality is, I could still make some arrangements, but I don't have 100% flexibility with my travel. These are things that workplaces have to kind of adjust and adapt to. These are realities that good organizations try to figure out solutions for.
What are some of the things you think that workplaces have started to do to adjust to that? When you've got this place of humans, they're all living different things, and then all of a sudden it changes, right? Like I might have kids in preschool or daycare. That's one evolution of kind of how they've grown up. What impact is that having psychologically on employees?
And I've got kind of a good and a bad example or scenarios. I'm not going to give exact examples, and to me, it's the difference, or one way I tee this up is the difference between optics versus impact. So optics is this idea of we need you in the office because people need to see you there. And there is some reality to that. I mean, optics are a real thing, and they impact morale, and they impact a lot of other things. So you have to be attentive to them for sure. But when they're overly rigid, what happens is we get focused on you need to be in the office just because I said so, because it looks like you're engaged. I like to turn the discussion to what's the impact. Like in a way, I don't care if you're in the office, if you're getting things done that you need to get done that move the business interests forward.
Yeah.
And then if there's still an optics problem, what I've seen in a lot of early consultation with companies, when we're kind of on the early front, is their way of dealing with that is say, well, optics are bad, everyone needs to come back in the office. Well, the problem is now that we're forcing you back into the office and to stay till 5:30, and you have to juggle all these things of getting the kids and out, actually your impact now is less than it was.
Right.
To make positive development for the business interests. And so the good companies understand optics, but they don't put optics over impact. So it's a question of functionally, are you able to do your job? Are you successful? Are you moving things forward and in a way that makes a positive impact? And if that's happening remotely, great.
So with those, I mean, because there's been a large push for that. I know government workers have been asked to come back into the office. You've got some larger kind of enterprise level employers making decisions with that. And you've got some that are like, no, we're going to stick to the remote. you have to what works the best for the organization, to your point, not just the optics, but like functionality wise, what works best. But the impact on those employees, they've established behaviors. Sleeping patterns are probably adjusted around remote work. You've got, lifestyles adjusted around. So what's the emotional impact that they're faced with, and how should an organization be responding to that? From what you've seen from a clinical perspective, we've actually responded to some workplaces that have experienced that.
We have.
Shift.
It's a great flag or a great point. What's interesting with that is the good ones. Again, I've got kind of the good example and the not so good example. The ones that do it well are the ones that say, we're going back to hybrid, or we're going back to full on-site. How does this impact you, Jamie? Let's have a dialogue about that.
Yeah.
Instead of saying, hey, this is a deal, get back to work. Because that's
or
where
walk out. Yeah.
Or walk out.
Yeah.
Or go find something else where you could still have that work-life integration. I'll explain later why I say integration and not balance. But that to me is where the good companies, the ones that really have a good approach to this. Now that doesn't mean you cater to every employee's whim. No.
Yeah.
But if you were to say, listen, on Tuesdays and Thursdays, I have to leave a bit early to pick up the kids, or I have to go to my aging mother's physical therapy session, she has no one else to bring her to, let's work that out.
Yeah, create like flexible schedule.
There you go.
Like a hybrid. Like I go into the office when I need to go into the office.
Yes. And then
I'm more than willing to do that.
And then treat you like a professional in that if you're doing your work and you're getting done what I need you to get done, or we as the organization need you to get done, no harm, no foul. Yeah. Now, if your productivity, if your work product starts faltering, then we have to have a much more difficult conversation.
Yeah.
And the ones that don't do it so well just have a rigid rule, everyone back to work. And here's the deal, right? Yeah. And so I think that balance is what the future is going to hold if you want to attract talent and retain talent. The reality is most people could probably go back. This may not be popular, by the way. Most people can probably go back to working in office if they had to. Between that and being homeless and unable to afford rent or the mortgage, they could figure it out. There are still some. So, it's funny, in the disability evaluation space, we talk about impairment, which is like, I can't do something, and tolerance, which is I could do it, but I won't like it. I think most people probably could figure out or navigate or adapt to going back in. Here's the rub for leaders. You could get them in, but are they going to do it in a way where now they're just slowly looking for their next opportunity?
Right. So that kind of gets to one of the things that we wanted to talk about today is kind of leaders, right? That leader readiness for navigating these challenges, like this shift in work environment that we're seeing across the board, this evolving workplace of different generations and their expectations of leaders. At the end of the day, they're looking to their leader. When things happen at work, when a disruption happens, when there is change like what you're experiencing, that leader is who people are looking up to as the model for how they should navigate it. And I would say even in the remote world they are, because for some, that's the only leader interaction they have within the organization is their boss.
Yep.
So let's talk a little bit about some of the leader challenges and what we're seeing in workplaces now.
I think a leader first has to start with a self-assessment of where are they on these dimensions. Like they have to have their North Star of what do they think works for the culture. Is it an organization? Is it a business sector? Is it a department where I really need my people in the room to be creative and working together? Or maybe it isn't at all, and that's fine. So that's the first thing. And then from there, really trying, we talked earlier, but really trying to be adaptive to what the needs are of people in the organization within reason, right? If you have 300 people in the organization, you can't have 300 schedules, right? It just isn't going to work. What I don't see enough is leaders polling or surveying their people to really get a sense of what might work. And I think for a while there has been a assumption by many leaders, especially older leaders, and I think I was guilty early on myself, being a Gen X, an older Gen X person, of assuming, oh, these younger folks, and maybe even some that might be older that want to work remotely, everyone's lazy. I mean, I didn't assume that, but there were moments like, well, everyone, of course, no one wants to work. But when you really survey or really take the pulse of your workforce, you find that people really do want to work.
We know that with the evolution of what workplaces are navigating, we get called in for a lot of different types of disruptions than what we might have 10 years ago.
Yes.
When you think about that leader and you think about what's being available from an EAP perspective, we talked a little bit about kind of this, every generation needs a little bit different. We find they're not actually tapping into support, right?
Correct.
So, so you've got this leader who's navigating these employees. They're sometimes the only face and the only, kind of higher up representation that they're getting exposed to. How does an organization make sure that that leader can show up their best self every day for the betterment of their people, but also for the betterment of the organization?
Yeah. Most leaders that are pretty good or even excellent, they will tend to die on their white horse before they get off and show vulnerability.
Yeah.
Right? Brene Brown talks a lot about this, and I imagine our audience is familiar
Absolutely.
with some of her work. We really need to develop the ability for leaders to say, hey, I'm struggling, right? Recently, the CEO of Lyra stepped down.
Yeah.
Sheryl Sandberg from Facebook wrote a book, it was a number of years ago, but she talked about her vulnerability and her risks. That was a brave thing to do, right? So we need a culture in which leaders can be aware of that, but they can show strength not by being strong traditionally, but by showing strength in vulnerability.
Yeah.
Because the problem is, if I'm a leader and I never falter, I could say to my team and my company all day long that, hey, it's okay to falter. It's okay to fall. But if I never do it, the hidden message is, what's the hidden message, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So what I really want to demonstrate is that I'm human. You said that earlier, right? It's about humans.
Yeah.
I'm human, and not only can I falter and fall down, but here's the big part, I can get back up. And that's the heart of resilience. It's not never falling. It's the ability to rebound, bounce back, and get back up. So I think it has to start at that level.
Yeah.
And those leaders that have the ability to mess back their messaging, right? To market that and message that, I think is key.
Yeah. And I think that giving, when you take a look at, being intentional, shifting some of that kind of stereotypical of like, oh, I've got to be strong, I can't show that vulnerability. I think having intention of like being open about it. Yeah. Because your people are going to follow what you do. Yep. Most leaders are in their position because they've got drive and they want to grow and they want to continue to excel in their career. Having the courage to be able to step up and get support. And there's ways that you can do that without communicating that you did.
That's right.
But there's some value in that intentionality of making it known. People become more comfortable with you.
And I think, Jamie, that's a great point around the grit and tenacity and drive. I mean, if you don't have that, you're probably not going to move up in a leadership position in the way that we're talking about with organizations and corporations. But that ability to acknowledge that you're human is just so important.
Well, and I think there's a lot that comes with being a leader that a lot of people, if you're not a leader, you're not aware of.
Yes. Yeah.
I mean, you're carrying the weight of what part of that organization you're running.
That's right.
And you're carrying, the struggles of your staff in a way too, because you're trying to help them to grow in their careers while growing in your own.
That's right.
It's not always all about you. And if you're not in a leadership role or haven't been in a leadership role, you don't always pick up on that. Right. Plus you've got, people that you're answering to above you. Yes. You've got goals, expectations.
Stakeholders, just
you're in that position for a reason. And I think the more high test, high stress industries, they're bearing a lot more of that weight. And that can really weigh on somebody. Yes. And then you've got the weight of home. Yes. I mean, that integration you talk about, I totally get that terminology. Kind of wrapping our episode up here, we've talked a lot of different angles, the work environment, the evolution of well-being in the workplace. We've talked a lot about leaders if you were going to give like your most important takeaways for businesses navigating these trends that are evolving and constantly evolving, kind of these needs, the multi-generational needs, young professionals versus older professionals, what are some of your key takeaways?
Yeah, that's a good one. And there's just so much to reflect on. Long hours does not equal poor well-being, right?
Right.
There's still some of the most healthy people I know psychologically work insane amounts of hours, but they're doing things with purpose and intention, as you said, and meaning, and they're finding the balance in the ways, or the integration in the ways that works for them.
Yeah.
So this assumption that, well-being just doesn't go with our, we're busy professionals. No, we could find a way through.
Yep.
Those are the key takeaways, the top
Love
ones.
that.
How about yours?
I think
What comes to mind?
Yeah, absolutely. We talked a lot about intentionality I think is absolutely key.
Yeah.
Because one, I think it's sending a message to your employees that you care. By being really intentional, one, finding out what it is that they truly want from a behavioral health perspective or a well-being perspective, and I think two, focusing some energy on your leaders. You and I have talked about that a lot, like where it's like, wow, we're busy and it's, it's for them, it's for our people.
Yeah.
Is it, so I think just really being mindful of when you're being intentional, looking at your leaders and how you can help support them. And I think communication is key.
So one of the interesting things that you were talking that also struck that I'd want to maybe do a takeaway on is the critical importance of emotional intelligence for all employees, but especially for leaders. Yeah. And what's interesting is, again, a lot of very senior leaders, those in the C-suite still today, came up in business, in organizations, in workplaces where that wasn't a high level value.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And at the same time, even myself came up at a time we didn't have iPhones, we didn't have social media. So the closest thing I had to learning emotional intelligence through all of my developmental years, up until a young adult, was the benefit of a few key mentors. Love my family, I love my parents, but I didn't learn it from them. They never sat me down and said, when you have conflict, this is the best way to handle it. It just didn't exist, right?
Right.
My kids, my daughter's 17, my son's 14, they grew up in an iPhone era. There's a lot of bad things they see on social media, but it's also amazing how mindful they are around self-awareness, self-regard, self-help, well-being concepts, emotional intelligence. My son could clearly describe that. When I was 14, no concept. And so there is a massive chasm between senior leaders and relatively younger, probably mid-20s up to your 30s, workers, in terms of their incubating, if I could use that term, in understanding emotional intelligence. And so one thing leaders, if you said to me, what is one coursework on LinkedIn or somewhere else that a senior leader should take? I'd say take a course on emotional intelligence.
Talent retention is key. Younger generations are not afraid to leave a job that they don't feel either values them, meets the same values and things that you care about. You've got, the shift in workplace dynamic again with this kind of moving back into the office setting, hybrid settings. What are strategies? What does a leader in a workplace need to know?
It starts with knowing where you are as a culture, knowing where you want to go as a culture, and then aligning your values around that in a way that you can maintain and attract talent that fits that culture. Or even if you attract talent, how do you develop them in a way that allows them to thrive?
Yeah.
Again, it's an extreme example, and Simon Sinek talks a lot about it, but the Navy SEALs is one of the most elite trained places. And he talks a lot about this, but it's a great point. What makes them tough and what makes them have the ability to do incredible things, it's not just that they're naturally tough. It's not even the training. It's the trust in the people on both sides of them.
Yeah.
And that trust allows you to be vulnerable. It allows you to take chances. And it also allows you to believe that you can do tough things. So those are the things, But it's built on support and trust. And so all of that, and that has to be built around the quality and the personality, the persona of what your culture is.
Yeah. And then add to that
Yeah, please.
and say, don't forget about your leaders. They're driving your
Correct.
culture. They're driving that environment you want your employees to thrive in.
Yes.
So they themselves need to thrive.
Yes.
And so focusing energy around their well-being, their performance, so they can be kind of that elite, special forces
right.
that are driving your
That's right.
people to success and ultimately your business to success as well.
Great point.
So yeah.
Yeah.
Awesome. Great episode, George.
Yeah, this is great.
Yeah.
It's always great
We
seeing you in
hope you
person.
enjoyed.
Yes.
Yes. Thank you all for listening. We hope you've enjoyed this episode of Thrive with R3.
R3 is a workplace behavioral health pioneer and innovator, providing rapid response and ongoing behavioral health solutions that help people and organizations recover, perform, and thrive in the wake of disruption and stress.
For more episodes, insights, and resources, visit thrivewithr3.com.